The road to Winterfell rose and fell like a frozen wave, white to every horizon, and Daenerys Targaryen rode at a walking pace so the men on foot could keep their warmth. The cold in the north did not simply bite. It pressed. It pressed against the face under a fur hood, and into the hollows of a saddle, and settled in the joints of the fingers no matter how thick the gloves. She held the reins in one hand and her cloak closed with the other, and beneath her the mare's breath lashed out in steady plumes that drifted and shredded in the steady wind. Above them Drogon circled, a black scythe against the thin winter sky, low enough that the beat of his wings threw little spirals of snow devils in the fields. Rhaegal lagged farther out, green against gray, beating back toward the sea, lazy and full from some far hunt. The line of Unsullied marched behind the queen's small escort, no more than 200 by her rule and that of the lady she was to meet, spears bristling, helms rimed in frost where their breath had climbed and cooled and settled in a glitter. She had expected the north to be bare stone and iron, all severity. It was severe, in its manner, but not bare. Snow laid a veil over everything, yes, but in every dip of land there was scrub tough enough to survive the season, dried to black and red and the pale beaten silver that storms give. When the wind shifted, she caught the tannic scent of pine and smoke, and once, passing a stand of leafless birches like a regiment of white-lace girls, she saw a wild mare in full take flight as if the long line of men were an absurd dream. Her own mare pricked her ears toward them and snorted softly, and Daenerys reached down to soothe her neck. The horse's warmth smoldered under all the layers. The animal was a hearth, moving. Missandei rode beside her, wrapped to the chin, eyes bright with the fur-trimmed hood cinched down tight. "He is watching the castle," she said, after a long quiet in which only the squeaking crunch of snow beneath hooves and boots had spoken. She lifted her eyes to Drogon's black length in the sky. "And watching you. He has always watched me," Daenerys answered, though she knew Missandei spoke not only of Drogon. Tyrion was farther back, bad at cold and worse at hiding it. He had tried for gallows humor that morning when the chapped skin had split on his knuckles tying his own cloak. Of all the songs sung in taverns, not one celebrated frostbite as a proof of kingship. He had smiled around red raw fingers, and she had smiled back, and yet she knew both of them felt their smiles had become a kind of armor against the scale of what they were doing. "You could have waited for better weather," Missandei said gently. It was the sort of gentle reminder Missandei gave when she wished to say a thing without presuming. "The weather will not wait for me," Daenerys said. "And the people there, the deep winter makes them foxes. They will see me if I come in comfort and judge me by it. Better to be judged for cold bones than warm arrogance." The road bent around another hill, and then Winterfell rose full in view to fill the world. A beast of stone crouched among its own smoke. It was not a pretty castle. It was a fortress, and the thick columns of steam rising from secret fissures in the grounds gave it an air both living and old. The outer wall threw back the winter light like a dull blade. On the ramparts, she could see figures in fur-lined cloaks already gathered to watch, and a deeper black against the white. The banner with the gray direwolf snapping out straight in the wind. The wind that cut down here was the same that had howled over Dragonstone's towers, but this wind had a voice beyond clean salt or bitter rain. It carried an old warning in it, like a story told so often it had been worn smooth and carried only the mood of the telling rather than the words themselves. "We're seen," said Grey Worm at her side. Helm down, spear rested easy against his shoulder. Form hold. No shields. No weapons drawn. "You ordered so." "I did." She turned in the saddle and raised her gloved hand. The line slowed, then checked. She could feel all the eyes, and none of them mattered more than her own resolve. Twice before in her life had she been stared at across a yard by a whole city or army as if she were a storm coming. At the gates of Meereen, under the walls of King's Landing. The difference now was not in their gaze, but in what she meant to bring through those gates. Behind them a cart creaked under the weight of a cask of fine wine from the arbor, carefully saved for gifts, and crates of glass rings and little knives from the east. Northern taste was not all wolf pelts and wooden bowls, and she had paid attention when Ser Davos hinted of the odd gift that could soften a hard city. But the elder gift was less glittering and harder to measure. She had left her full strength behind. No great fleet, no dragons snorting fire over the gates in a demonstration. She would not reduce Winterfell to a lesson. It was a place that had been too many men's lessons too often. At a nod from the gatehouse, the portcullis rattled up within the archway, the iron teeth clinking against their guides, and the great split oak doors beyond began to swing inward. The slow shift brought with it a breath of warmer air, damp and metallic. The line moved. She tried not to lean forward in her saddle like a girl at her first tourney. She would go in as she had meant, at a slow pace, with her head high, the curls that had escaped the hood furrowed with frost like threads of glass. A woman waited just inside the yard, dressed for the cold in gray and white and a dark mantle whose edge was embroidered with the fine work one only saw when a house had kept its pride even through ruin. Red hair coiled under a fur cap. She was not tall, but she made the space around her taller. She was surrounded by bristling guards in leather and chain who took in the unsullied. With expressions like flint, she herself was still, a wolf at the moment between standing and moving. "Lady Sansa Stark," said Tyrion under his breath. "Lady of Winterfell, if one is counting titles, which I sometimes do to stay warm." She glanced at him and then back at the woman. Sansa came forward the last few steps across the trampled snow. She did not bow deeply, but she bowed. The bow was measured as if she were passing a verdict of her own. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was lower than Daenerys had expected, carrying, shaped by stone halls. "You come to my gates under guest right. Winterfell will keep that faith." "I am grateful for its faith," Daenerys answered, and slid from the saddle before anyone could be pushing at her stirrup. Her legs had gone numb and then burned as her feet slid into snow. The cold shocked through the soles. She crossed the space between them and took Sansa's offered hands in her own. They were narrow hands, ringed in silver, cold but steady. "I have come to talk and to listen." Something like curiosity, quickly hidden, moved behind Sansa's eyes. "Then we will do both with a hearth between us," she said. "Bread and salt first." They walked together across the yard toward a door heavy enough to comfort a siege. The yard smelled of horses, of iron, of wet fur and the steam that rose from the cracks of the earth. Grey Worm ordered the men to their billets. The words were not known in this place, but tone needed no translation. Drogon passed over them once, lower than before, a vast shadow that made all the men's heads tilt up. Sansa had not flinched. She looked upward as a woman looks to a storm that she believes she can endure. Then she glanced sidelong at Daenerys and smiled very slightly. It was not warmth so much as recognition. Then they were inside. The great hall of Winterfell had flags hung along the beams. The direwolf repeated, so often it became a kind of drumbeat to the eye. Smoke climbed in soft tatters from the braziers and the hearth down the middle of the hall, thick with the smell of wood still half green. It was warmer by far than any air outside could be, almost close, and it made the skin of Daenerys' face sting as if waking up. Servants came forward with a trencher and a small heap of salt. Daenerys broke the loaf without ceremony and dipped it. Sansa watched her and did the same. The bread was brown, seedy, sturdy, and a little sweet. Bread that filled a day. "Your men will have the same," Sansa said, "and their own space. We have little silk for bedding, but the wool is good. They will thank you for the wool more than any silk," Daenerys said. She slid a glance down the hall to where men were coming and going with purposeful movements. No jostle, little laughter. It was a hall where people had learned to do without delight for so long they did not notice its absence until confronted by it. She wondered what sound a laugh would make if it could unthaw in such a place. "You keep a tight house." Sansa's forehead creased very slightly. "It keeps itself when the roofs hold and the stores are enough," she said. "We've had winters when they were not. I had to learn how to see through walls. The men will tell you how many barrels of oats are in the eastern granary or the number of waxed candles left without thinking to tell you the rats have found the south store because the door swells and gaps when it thaws and refreezes. If I do not ask where the grain dust is settling, I do not know how little flour we have left." "I understand rats," Daenerys said. "I have seen them at feasts. They may be wearing better clothes, but they gnaw as hard." The words came out and she watched Sansa weigh them. The redness at the corners of the woman's eyes, the dryness of her lips, it was not vanity that guided her, but it was no poverty of calculation either. Lady Sansa had learned to see through men and walls. In a smaller chamber off the Great Hall, with a square table scarred by years of knives, the two of them sat with wine steaming in metal cups that could burn the mouth if one was not careful. Tyrion took a seat at Daenerys' shoulder with a grunt of relief and laid his frosted gloves out on the table like a pair of strange animals. Missandei melted into the space behind Daenerys' chair, always there without demanding acknowledgement. A handful of Winterfell's counselors took chairs on their ladies' side. A lean woman with lines pressed into her face by weather rather than age. A man with a scar the length of his cheek who wore a ring of keys at his belt. Another whose ink-stained fingers worried at a twig above a pile of parchment. It was not the pomp of Dragonstone or King's Landing. It was a council that looked like it lived the problems it named. Say what you came to say, Sansa invited without preamble. My stores do not add grain because we speak long, and my people do not warm themselves by hearing who sits what chair in the south. I have come for the north, Daenerys said. The room's quiet caught the words gently. Not to take it, to ask for its hand. Tyrion did not move. Missandei did not move. Outside, one of the braziers popped. Sansa's lashes lowered and lifted. You already hold many hands, she said. If you are offering me a name as you offered to other lords and cities, I will tell you plainly, the North remembers until its memory grows teeth. We did not flay ourselves free only to sew the skin back on. It is not a name, Daenerys said. The winter outside seemed to sharpen her sense of the shape of her own words, to pare them down. I want the wheel to stop breaking us, Lady Sansa. Sansa's mouth tightened wryly. You have said as much. A wheel turns because something gives it a push. If you stop all the hands, will you not still have the thing itself? Not if we change the hub. Daenerys took in the small motions of the room, the way the woman with the weathered face nodded slightly as if to say she had no. She expected a mechanical argument and now found herself privileging it all the same. You know how to see through walls. I am learning to see through the stories we tell. The old stories begin with one house breaking another and end with a crown. Then as soon as they end, they begin again. In the south, they will always find another crown. I know it. I have worn a few. In the north, she let the word hang until it turned. The winter puts all crowns into the same pot and boils them until only the iron stays. You pass bread and salt under those same laws as your poorest shepherd. I have seen places the law belongs to whomever can pay for it. I would be done with that. I would bind myself to a place where keeping holds and truth holds because the season itself forces our hands to the same work. Binding yourself to a cold wind will not make it blow softer, Sansa said. Her face softened despite herself when Missandei set a small plate of dried apple slices between them. She took one, laid it against her lower lip thoughtfully, and then ate it. But I am listening. I will say it plain, Daenerys said quietly. You know me for what I am. There are statues of my house's old sins wherever men remember the smell of ash. There are statues of yours where men speak the word honor and mean it. If I am to build a thing that cannot be torn down by the next man clever enough to count to 5, I need to set it upon stone that has outlasted worse men than me. Bind me to your stone. Sansa did not answer at once. She did not look to her counselors for guidance, not overtly. The ink-stained man had stopped worrying at his twig and was simply holding it now, white-knuckled. Tyrion was watching the steam rise from his cup as if it could read him a future. Missandei breathed as evenly as a woman asleep, though Daenerys could feel her attention the way a horse feels the weight of a hand. Bind you how? Sansa asked at last, and the question was not mockery. It was careful, open. In marriage, Daenerys said. The little noise it produced around the table was not loud, more a collective intake of air as the room remembered it had ribs. Not for show, not to use you and put you aside. To make the North and me accountable to one another until one of us grows old and dies. To set in print and stone that the children born of my houses will owe their first loyalty to the safety of people who do not care what sigil flies in a southern city, because they have to dig their door out of a drift before they can open it. Sansa's face did not change. Her fingers did, just slightly, making the silver rings knock softly together. To what end? She asked. Not the poetry of it. The working. Daenerys leaned forward until she could smell a good resin in the cup, strong and bitter and saving. To refashion the councils, she said. A council of the North that has the right to cast or accept my veto. A council of smallholders empowered to petition me directly at set times. An agreement that coin raised in the North remains in the North to be dispersed by law, with oversight you name. A holding in Wintertown for the free folk if they wish to come south at season's turn. Trials held under your law. My men under your command when they are in your land. My dragons. She paused. Sansa's eyes sharpened. My dragons restricted by a charter written here. No burning of fields without writ. No fear flights over towns except at your express call. The keyring at the scarred man's belt chimed once. The weathered woman crossed her arms and relaxed them again. Sansa looked at Daenerys as a seamstress looks at a bolt of cloth before she decides on the cut. And how does a marriage accomplish that which a treaty cannot? She asked. Treaties are eased aside by men who have learned how to make ink run, Daenerys said. Marriage is bone. And then, because the truth would be better plain than dressed. And because treaties have been my language for years, and look at the story that has still been told in spite of them. It was the most naked she had been in a long time. She let the nakedness sit. The room's small warmth wrapped around it. Outside, the wind dragged itself against the stone skin of the castle and could not get in. Sansa said, If I were a different woman, I might ask if you mean me or my house. I mean House Stark, Daenerys said, but I will not pretend the person at the heart of a house has no value to me. I have learned, sometimes late, to respect the particular as well as the general. I will speak with your consent, seek it, even when I could make do without. I will go north when you go north. I will be seen eating what you eat, sleeping where you sleep. I will make myself answer to you because I wish to be answerable to someone who has no stake in fire. Sansa's breath left her in a faint fog. She stood and went to the small window that pierced the wall there, no bigger than a child's slate, and stood looking out at a slice of yard and pale sky. When she turned back, her eyes were the same color as the cold. You will want to see the heart tree, she said. If this is to be anything but paper, that is where it begins. Daenerys stood as well. She glanced once at Tyrion. He was very still, which in him was deliberation. Missandei's nod was so small it would have been invisible to any who did not know her. The weathered woman got to her feet with the soft, dilating sigh of an old leather strap settling. The key man stood, and the inked one. They moved together toward a side passage. The hall beyond was narrower, the stones sweating a little with the press of warmer damp inside and cold outside, and then a door, and then the godswood. All her travels had taught Daenerys that sacred spaces announce themselves differently in each place. In Meereen, the temples were big and bright like girls at a fair. In Dragonstone, the silence of the cave under the keep had been so total she had felt a word. There could only be an interest. Ion. Winterfell's godswood felt used. That was the compliment to it. The way the snow had been trampled into curves and hollows where people had walked and knelt, smoothed by many hands into steps that did not trip the feet. The heart tree rose at the center, a shock of red against the white, leaves like banners caught in a wind that did not blow so much as drift. Its face was an old face, and for all its strangeness, she had the absurd sense it was measuring her height. Sansa went first, as if to greet a friend, and then stepped aside. We ask here, she said simply. Daenerys had never bent the knee before a god of a people not her own. She had bowed to old mothers and to little boys with more coin than sense. She had let clever men push her toward altars because it suited them to see her kneel, and those altars had burned later. This was different in part because it was inconvenient. The damp came up through the soles of her boots and the wet air gnawed her throat. She could not imagine the story of herself in future years as a sort of saint in white furs, steam rising from her mouth like incense, kneeling before an old, bleeding tree. It would look foolish, which meant, she found, that she trusted it. She bent her knees on her own timing and the earth took her weight. The bark beside her was cold and slightly wet, and rougher than it looked. She put her palm to it. The tree's carved eyes trickled their faint red runnels. She felt, oddly, like a girl in her first home again, palm flat against canvas to feel where the wind pounded it into the ribs of the tent. My name is Daenerys, she said softly, addressing the tree because she could not say old gods without hearing herself as a liar. The leaves hissed against one another. I have known many rooms. I have knocked down walls and found I still wanted more light. I am told this place remembers better than others. Remember me if I lie. Remember me if I fail. I want to bind myself to stone. I want to give a part of my fire to cold and see if it burns steadier. Snow sifted in a fine lace from a branch above, laying a delicate pattern on her hood. She kept her hand on the bark and then lifted it and stood. Sansa was watching her with her head tipped to one side, the assessing look again but warmer around the edges, as if Daenerys had told a joke that was not very good, but that at least she had told it on herself. "We do not take oaths here lightly," Sansa said. "We do not break them lightly either. Not for comfort, not for fear." "I know," Daenerys said. "I have come for something that will cut me, not something that will clothe me." Sansa nodded once. "We will talk again at dusk. I will call my bannermen who can come in time. The rest will send their answer by horn and raven. The north does not move quickly when there is ice on the steppes. Neither does a dragon," Daenerys said. It was almost a joke. Sansa almost smiled for real. The cold pressed closer, but it seemed less an enemy now and more a condition of the air, like the smell of pine or smoke. The rest of that day had the feeling of a tide running in two directions, the slow, incoming weight of northern attention, and the faint undertow of her own people adjusting to a new shore. In the training yard, Grey Worm put her men through their paces with pick and spear, impossible not to admire, even by Northmen who had not yet decided whether to hate them. Davos Seaworth arrived from White Harbor at sunset, bringing with him the warmth only certain men carried, not in degrees of heat but in degrees of trust, and spoke quietly with the foreman of the smithy, with the steward of the kitchens, with any sergeant willing to listen. He had a way of making people believe they had told him what was needed when he was the one doing the telling. Missandei found the hall where the house's records were kept, long strips of parchment with crude but serviceable signs counting sheep and barrels and bolts of cloth, and sat with the inked man and the weathered woman to ask questions about the pace of winter, about whether debt was counted publicly or household by household. Even Tyrion, who had a talent for standing very still while his mind moved fast, took himself to the corner of the hall where children were being taught their letters around a slate and listened as the bent-back schoolmaster drilled the vowels in an old sing-song. He kissed a child's head when she recited without thinking, surprising himself as much as her, and stood a long time watching the small chalky hand draw curves that would one day spell out the threats and concessions of his own kind. Daenerys walked. The castle arranged itself beneath her feet in a way that made her feel as if she had returned to a place she had never visited. That was how a true house felt, she realized. Like a game with rules worn so smooth by being played for so long that new players slid their hands into it naturally. She watched bakers knead dough without hurry. She watched a girl spin wool with a spindle as if her fingers were telling the spindle where to go and not the other way round. She stood a long while with the tackmaster, an old, square man with a scar across his lip, while he described the problem with winter leathers, stiffening, cracking, the way salt made it brittle and how fat could save it, but only certain fats. Beef tallow if you're a fool, he concluded. Bear if you're lucky, whale if you're rich, goose if you're clever. He looked at her with surprise and humor when she told him of the cross saddles favored by Dothraki riders, and then of the carpenters in Meereen who had devised a new way to bend wood over steam to make it carry weight without adding weight. "You've seen so much," he said, not flatteringly, more in awe of the size of the world. "And yet too little," she answered. "There are still rooms inside me where I have not opened the shutters." She went to see the dragons. Drogon had settled on the flat, open space outside the eastern wall where the heat of the springs hollowed the snow to thin, glassy sheets around dark grass. He looked wrong in winter, as if the season itself wanted to reject him, all heat and curve and savage line, and he accepted the rejection with the arrogance of a creature who had never asked permission. Rhaegal returned at dusk with the smell of blood on his muzzle. The northern men who came to look stood at a distance, hands shoved deep in mittens, faces as blank as the snow beyond the dragon's steam. Ghost came too, white on white, almost fading, but his red eyes gave him away at every step. He stopped 10 paces from Drogon and simply watched. Drogon watched back. Daenerys held her breath as something very old and very quiet moved between them. The wolf's breath smoked. The dragons did too. Each regarded the other as if they were looking into a pool and seeing a reflection that was not their own. "They know a thing we don't," said a voice behind her. She turned and found a young woman with hair cropped short, a face no longer a girl's but not yet carved into a woman's lines, dressed in simple wool with a knife at her belt, hands bare because she did not seem to notice the cold. Gray eyes looked into the winter as if it were merely a path to be chosen. "Or they know that they do not and are curious." "Arya," Daenerys said, recognizing the face she had been told a dozen stories about without ever seeing. "I thought you were in the south." "I go where I need to," Arya said, "and where dinner is sometimes, when it's been a while." Ghost's ears pricked. He wanted to see the dragons. The way she said it made it seem entirely reasonable, as if it were similar to wanting to see a new kind of bread. "I am glad he came," Daenerys said, meaning it. "I would have brought them to the yard if your sister had asked, but perhaps it is better they are here." Arya's mouth crooked. "You think the yard is for show?" She did not make it a question. "You aren't wrong. In there we are all coat and collar and counting how hard the wind will make us look." Daenerys did not say what sprang to her lips first, that she was tired of coats and collars because she looked fine in them. Instead she said, "You love her." "I love her," Arya said, "so I want her to go to bed safe and wake safe." "Does your plan do that?" The blade at her belt was nothing extravagant, but like everything else in the north, it had been used until it had learned the hand that held it. "Yes," Daenerys said, "not because I am a magician, because I am a good bargain." Arya laughed then, sharp and short in the cold air. "I like a good knife," she said, "and I like a good bargain. The trick with both is not to cut your own fingers off." "We will try not to," Daenerys said. Drogon lowered his head abruptly and blew a breath across the snow toward Ghost. The wolf took a step back, thoughtful rather than afraid. Rhaegal settled his wings, a slow leather sound. "People here don't make change easily," Arya said, and the way she said it made it more a kindness than a warning. "But when they make it, they put it in the wall like a stone, and nobody ever gets it out again." She glanced at Daenerys. "If you're offering to be a stone, we'll see if you're the sort that doesn't crack in a frost." "I do not crack," Daenerys said, but she did not say it as a boast. She said it as if she were reminding herself of her own body's history. The horns sounded at dusk, two long notes that seemed to dip the sky a little. The men in the yard began to flow toward the hall. Arya vanished the way some people step around a corner, not in a hurry, simply elsewhere. Daenerys followed the movement of bodies, of breath and boot, and the sound of someone laughing high and immediate, like an unplanned fire catching for a moment in dry wood and then settling. The hall that had been so serious by daylight felt warmer now for the same reason a hearth does, simply because people stood near it telling one another about the work of the day. Banners hung straight, no draft today to trouble them. Sansa was already there at the high table, standing, waiting without tapping her fingers, without shifting her weight, her stillness an order in itself. Men and women came and stood below her, closer than most lords allowed and yet not too close to presume. There were faces as narrow and sharp as axes. There were faces broad and a little silly. There were faces the winter had carved until they were all cheekbone and eye. So many eyes. "This is Winterfell," Sansa said, as if answering a question that had never left Daenerys' mouth. "It remembers who fed it and who starved it. It remembers every hand." She lifted her chin. "Hear me." The hall listened. Even the fire seemed to change its voice. "We are asked for a thing we have not been asked in living memory," Sansa said. "It is not meat and mead. It is not more wood for the roofs, nor more men for the walls. It is not a price for bread, nor a payment in gold. We are asked for a binding. We are asked for a marriage between House Stark and the Queen of Dragons." She let the words settle like crust on a pool. "I say this. I have heard more reasons to do it than to refuse it. Now I will hear more." Men spoke. Not all. Not in the southern fashion where everyone learned to polish their words as if presenting a blade. Here 2 or 3 stood each in turn, and when one spoke he did not push another aside. A man with a scar that had healed badly told of the first time he had seen the Unsullied's drill. "I've never seen men move like a hinge," he said, and paused, as if trying to make his voice simple enough to be understood by the hall. If we can put that hinge in our door, it will swing smooth when we need it." A woman who had lost 2 sons when a tower fell in a storm said she did not trust any roof that had not stood for longer than this new binding could promise. An old man muttered that dragons were bad luck, and then Rined when a boy called out from behind his uncle's leg that dragons were surely good in winter because they made fires. "What is luck?" someone else replied, and people laughed, short and affectionate. The laughter made the air bearable and then faded like a thaw dusk. Tyrion spoke then. He had forgotten he pronounced his S's differently than Northerners, or that he bent his words around wine. He did not flatter them. He told them he trusted a place where bread and salt meant something. "I have spent most of my life in rooms," he said, "and the trouble with rooms is that doors always open and shut when you least like it. You have made a room with a door so heavy it moves only when you want it to." He lifted his cup in salute to Sansa and moved no closer elsewise. Davos spoke, milder. "Storms don't ask if you have the right roof," he said. "They find it out. Best to build the roof together so you can blame each other later." The hall liked that, and the laughter this time was easier. Daenerys spoke last. She kept her hands on the edge of the table rather than clutching the cup. "I have burned and been burned," she said, and the candor made the room tighten and then relax again. "I will not pretend that is someone else's story. I have been a savior in one city and a destroyer for another person's father in the next. If I am to end that pattern, I cannot end it alone. Your lady asked me to say to what end this marriage would serve. I say, let it bind me to a law that I did not write and cannot soften because I am cold and want a fire. Hearts hunger for other hearts that hunger truthfully." She saw that in some of the faces lift and some of the shoulders ease. She saw in other faces the stubbornness that had kept them when easier people would have gone south long ago and picked a flatter land to plant. She respected that stubbornness enough to expect it to outlast any speech of hers tonight. At the end, Sansa took the hall's mood like a weaver picks up the weft and weaves it over the warp. "We will hold a mote of men," she said. 2 days. Those who cannot come in that time will send their votes by raven. The heart tree will hear the binding. There will be no other gods in it. That is our law." She looked at Daenerys with a look that was not a threat and not consolation. "Until then, you and yours are under my roof." It was both a truce and a foretaste of what living with a mind equal to her own would be like. Daenerys bowed as deep as her spine would allow. "My thanks, Lady Sansa." That night the wind found the places where the old stone met the newer stone and sang there. It sang in little pipes. It tucked itself into the hairline crack above the great door and whispered to its own echo. Daenerys slept in a chamber that some ancestor had meant for a girl. Perhaps. There was a window seat with a box under it for the storing of gloves, and a little alcove where a small shrine might have been set when the gods were younger. The bed was hard. The furs were good. She lay for a while very still, then rose and paced until her body warmed and her mind cooled. Missandei, wrapped on a pallet by the door, lifted her head, saw that Daenerys was not a ghost but only a woman pacing, and closed her eyes again. When she could not keep still, Daenerys lit a candle and held it near the window to watch the flame burn straight in the still of the chamber, and tilt when the wind found a hair-thin way in. It was nothing to do with dragons at all, the pleasure she took in watching that behavior. It was something to do with being a person in a place and noticing what that place did. In the morning, frost had crusted the inside of the window. She scraped it with her nail and inspected the small pieces of it on her fingertip. She thought of the great wheel she had named to herself for years, the great inevitability of it, and she thought, not derisively, how childish it had been to imagine it as a machine that might be broken by a single blow. You did not break frost you lived in. You changed the house so that the frost found no purchase. You moved the cracks. You heated the cold seams. She ate porridge with currants with the people in the hall and did not fuss when a little boy, scowling with the effort of carrying 2 bowls at once, spilled one on her boot. She had to swallow a laugh when his mother cuffed him lightly, and then she and Missandei helped set the bowls right. People watched. Watching was their duty as much as gathering wood. With each choice she felt how they were counting. By noon the first of the northern lords began to arrive in greater number, stamping snow from boots, hawking into their hands to warm them, greeting Sansa with careful courtesy and polite no's and yes. The Mormonts came without their young lady, who had died bravely in a battle that still rattled the voices of those who told it. They came with a woman whose face was both new and old. The Umbers sent a thick-shouldered man with sorrow in his mouth and a gift of skins. The Karstark sent a girl not much older than the maid tending Daenerys' fire, stiff with pride and fear, who took it as a kindness when Missandei asked about the weaving in her gloves. The Manderleys came with their own smell of salt and said the right words in the right order, and then made Daenerys laugh with an aside about fish the size of boats that all boys in their house had failed to catch in any story told by their grandfathers. There were men who stiffened at the sight of Drogon's shadow crossing the yard. There were women who looked at the Unsullied and recognized in them the discipline they had forced on their own grief and softened. The hall became a field of small negotiations in which kindnesses did not owe kindnesses but offered them, where pride could be let alone without being indulged. Daenerys and Sansa passed among them like women carrying different lamps, hers brighter and harder, Sansa's lower and warmer. Where one light was not welcome, me, the other might be. On the second afternoon of the moat, Jon Snow rode in with men from the wall, and the yard changed texture simply because he was in it. Some people carry calm, some carry hunger. He carried consequence without seeking it. He took in Daenerys with one of those looks of his that read a person and then set the knowledge aside without comment. Not because it did not matter, but because there was a moment and this was not it. He greeted Sansa with a long hug that told Daenerys more about his leaving and returning than any speech. He greeted Arya with a look that made them both look away quickly as if to keep something for themselves. He greeted Daenerys last and bowed to her with more formality than warmth, and that too was a kindness. He had learned that warmth complicated everything and formality only most things. They stood together, briefly, at the edge of the yard and watched the dragons in their cold circle. They should not fly so low, he said. The men feel it in their bones when they do. They are hunting the heat seams, Daenerys said. There are vents near the tree line. They will not hurt your men. I know, he said, and it was not that he did not believe her. It was that he was the sort of man who knows a thing and still names it again as a habit against sorrow. I heard what you intend. You and half the North, she said with a tired humor that he accepted. What do you intend? To stay out of your way, he said. To tell Sansa what I think when she asks. He paused. She has learned to ask. And you? I have learned to answer what I can answer and not try to answer the rest. He looked at her then, directly, and the pity there was not the pity she had feared when she had looked at him in other places, other rooms. It was the pity a friend gives a friend when he knows the slope they are on is steep and the ice beneath will not all be visible. If you take this oath and keep it, people will say you are a fool. If you take it and break it, they will say you are your father's daughter. Those are the shapes you are offered. Make us draw a new one. It was a blessing as good as any in a sacred place. She nodded. Thank you. The hour chosen for the binding was not noon, as in the south where the seven were meant to see everything, nor midnight, as in some eastern places where men imagined they could cheat gods by doing holy work when they slept. It was that hour that comes and goes quickly in winter, the hour of pale gold before the sun slides behind the land. The hall emptied and the yard did too. People gathered in the godswood until the old tree was the axis around which their breath turned. There was very little said aloud. Sansa had had the words laid out the night before, and they were simple words, heavy words. She wore white that was not pure but useful, fur that had hidden the body heat of 30 beasts before it came to her, wool thick enough to be a blanket in a barn. Her hair was the color of certain sunsets men died for. She had laid no jewels on herself except the simple torque that had been her mother's and a ring of her mother's mother's that had survived a war and a winter in the bottom seam of a traveling cloak. Daenerys had kept to white and gray as well, not as mimicry but as acknowledgement, and because she discovered she loved the way the absence of color concentrated the eye on form, on the straightness of a shoulder, on the clean line of a jaw, on the way hands have no choice but to reveal themselves when they are not decorated. They stood before the heart tree. The face above them watched. Sansa spoke first, and her voice held only a little break before it settled into its own rhythm. Old gods who watch with eyes that do not tire, hear me, she said. Winterfell has kept your peace and broken it and asked forgiveness. I am your servant in this house, and I am its keeper as long as it keeps me. I ask a binding and a blessing. Daenerys of the blood of fire asks to be bound under our law. I will answer for her if she breaks it. She will answer for me if I break it." She reached for Daenerys' hand, and Daenerys placed her hand willingly in Sansa's. The cold of Sansa's fingers surprised her again. "We bind for the sake of people with no sigils. We bind for the sake of water when it freezes and bread when it is too dear. We bind because alone we have learned our limits, and together we might learn a shape that makes more sense than the one that has been drawn around our throats." "It is good to speak plain," murmured the old woman of weather behind them, not unkindly. A few of the gathered men made the low sound many men make when they are moved and do not wish to let tears be the language for it. Daenerys spoke. She did not speak like a queen. She spoke like a woman in winter with a roof over her head. "Hear me," she said. "I have come from rooms with braziers that burned red and rooms with no braziers at all. I have slept on ship decks and in palaces. I have been told I was the beginning of a story and the end of one. I have bled under banners I did not sow. I have brought banners down on heads that did not deserve them. I ask to bind myself to a law that is not my own because my own law failed me and others when it counted. I ask you to be witness because witness is the only thing that keeps people honest." Her hand tightened around Sansa's. "If I lie, let it be told. If I fail, let me be called what I am. If I keep faith, let that be remembered too." There was no priest to mark it with oil. There was no book. Sansa turned to the weathered woman, who was the keeper of keys and of stories, and took from her a thin length of leather dyed red. She wound it once around their joined hands, snug, and tied it in a knot that was not tricky. It would hold. That was all. "By the witness of the tree and the law that has governed us longer than written words," she said, "we bind." There was a minute sound as breath left many Lewin. "Gs at once." A raven cried somewhere beyond the wood, hoarse, as if it had been talking all day and taken in too much dust. Ghost's red gaze glowed and then seemed to settle. Drogon's shadow crossed the snow and then receded, the size of a god's hand passing very near. Regal's wing beat stirred a few leaves into a last brave whisper. They did not kiss. They did not make a show. It would have felt wrong, and not all bindings need heat at their first moment. Sansa's fingers were firm in Daenerys's, and then they were not. The leather stayed knotted around both their wrists, making them aware with each motion of the other. They turned together and faced the gathered. The people looked back as if they had expected to see some trick of light, steam rising from their wrist knot, or the hearth behind the hall going out suddenly, or some sign in the snow. It is always a little disappointing to realize that history is made in the same air one has been breathing all along. And then it liftingly is not disappointing at all. There was a feast because there must be, but Sansa kept it short and good. To call it guileless would be wrong. It was accurate. Sweet root carrots stewed with onions and venison pie thick enough a knife could stand in it. Bread and apples baked until they fell apart. Ale that tasted of iron and hay in the best of ways, and a little cask of wine from the arbor that she poured herself into cups set aside for the elders and for Daenerys' hand-picked visitors. Musicians played without flourish because their fingers were stiff and because they were not showmen. It was a feast that kept body and body together, which is all a feast need do. Tyrion grew red-cheeked and sentimental and made a speech that set half the hall laughing and the other half looking at their hands with fond embarrassment, as if he had confessed a small infatuation. Davos told a story that was not his and made it seem as if it had been his all along, which is a kind of art that neither offends nor deceives. Missandei smiled so gently at a child who came to stare at the knot around Daenerys and Sansa's wrists that the child forgot to be afraid. Grey Worm stood very long against a wall where the heat of a brazier made the air shimmer and watched the room and did not know where to put his hands, and then found he had put them exactly right by doing nothing with them at all. Jon spoke very little and drank less. Arya danced without smiling, as if she were doing a drill that made her happy. At the high end of the table, Sansa leaned in only as far as the leather would allow, which made the closeness measured rather than sudden. "What do you expect from the south now?" she murmured. "What I always have," Daenerys said, "that it will try to pull at me by the obligations it says I cannot ignore, that it will call me disloyal for placing hungry mouths above old chairs." She took a sip of ale and let it sit on her tongue, swallow bitter first and then the sweet that comes if one waits. We will have to write this in language they cannot twist. They will still twist it. We will have to anchor it here so the twisting does not matter. We will write a charter, Sansa said. We will carve a copy into the stone where the old kings kept their lists of debts and gifts. Let them fetch chisels if they want to change it. You are very good, Daenerys said. It sounded like a blessing. It was also relief. Sansa did not smile. The set of her mouth was satisfaction, which is a different and better thing. Later, when the music had thinned and the hall had become half empty in an honest way, the two of them slipped out by a door that let them into a narrow corridor where torches burned with little bowls of oil under their iron brackets. It smelled of the simple salvation of tallow and smoke. The knot on their wrists made them slow down without resentment, and their steps found a rhythm no one had taught them. They came out on the outer walk that wrapped part of the keep and stood together where the stone soaked up the cold and gave it back in small doses like a miser. The yard below was dark and then not each time a man passed with a torch toward a post and then on toward the next. The sky had cleared. Stars lay very close to the earth in the north, as if they too felt the weight of the winter pressing them down. Dragons were somewhere beyond, and their shapes were only guessed at. Somewhere in the dark a horse stamped its impatience and then, reassured by nothing, settled. I thought I had to choose between good and making, Daenerys said at last. Men kept telling me it was so. I could be a good woman and marry where I was told and inherit my usefulness. Or I could make a new thing and be feared for it and hated for it and sometimes love the hate when it warmed me. I did not understand that I could make a good thing and be forced to answer for it every day until I died. That is what this is. Yes, Sansa said. She was not looking at Daenerys. She was looking at the yard. You may be beloved here 1 year and doubted the next. You will serve and then be told you served wrong because a freak season made the apples rot on the tree. You will not be given the comfort of certainty. You will be given the work. I like work, Daenerys said. She did not say it defiantly. She discovered as she said it that it was true. Sansa turned her head then and looked at her. Good, she said, and her eyes were softer now, less winter, more river ice with good water moving under it. Because I mean to give you a great deal of it. They stood a little longer. Their fingers remembered one another honestly because the leather taught them to. Daenerys could feel Sansa shift the balance of her weight and knew, without looking, where her hips angled, how her spine found a line against the cold. The night gnawed at their cheeks. The lamp behind them hissed in its little bowl and then steadied. When they went in, they went the long way around to AV. Oid, the place where two drunk men had slid themselves to the floor and were singing a song that had been made obscene by time and then cleaned again by loss, and whose obscenity now was in the way it pretended there had never been loss. They parted at the door of Daenerys's chamber because it was not right yet to do otherwise, and because right is a real thing, not an invention to quiet the gossip of grandmother men. They lifted their hands together and untied the leather. Sansa coiled it and put it in a pocket on the inside of her cloak. The pocket a lady learns a house has use for. The pocket where knives and letters go. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Daenerys said. It had a weight that was as great as any now. Sleep did not take her quickly. She lay under the firs and listened to the castle talk to itself and not to her. She thought of treaties that were not paper anymore but flesh, and of the work of turning a promise into a practice. She thought of the charter. She thought of small councils. One of smallholders and fishermen and old women who kept keys. One of craft masters who knew how to make an iron hinge swing so smooth no frost could seize it. One of outcasts who knew how law looked from outside its door and could say when the door shut too soon. She began to recite them to herself. She would ask Missandei to draft the bones and Tyrion to scrape off the bones' ornaments and Sansa to set the bones in good positions so the creature could stand. She smiled in the dark at her own image and then smiled at the smile, which was becoming a habit not of pride but of recognition of her own foolishness when it came. In the morning, the work began as quietly as frost creeping over a stone. The inked man brought his pens and his twigs and his habit of truth and sat near the hearth with Missandei and the weathered woman and Tyrion and Davos and a boy with eyes the color of creek water who had been brought by his mother because he could run to fetch anyone any paper and because, more importantly, he listened. Sansa presided not with ceremony but with attention. She said very little and then suddenly said the thing that made 3 sentences in the new charter collapse into one and actually mean something. Daenerys set down her desire for broad promises in favor of a clause that named who could call for a vote and how many households counted as a vote and where that vote would take place. They argued about whether a dragon could sub in an emergency to dry a granary when a cracked roof had let snow melt in and the grain was sprouting. They realized, laughing at the strangeness of it, that they needed a section in law called dragons, as if this were a matter as ordinary as counting sheep. The first day was all bones. The second day put flesh on them. Northern lords who had scoffed in their beards at the notion of letting fishmongers speak at their bench found themselves nodding to a wizened woman with a voice like a hinge who explained what happened when a man with coin bought all the fish at the dock and how that price set the hunger of the whole winter. Men who had thought of dragons as only the thing that either saved them from other men or burned them discovered they could also imagine them as creatures that warmed the road teams that dug the passes in late winter so that trade could begin a week earlier. A boy from Wintertown who had learned his letters by smearing his own spit and stood across a slate to darken it and then scratching with a piece of bone, stood up and said his name in a voice he did not himself recognize and asked what happened when a lord took a poor man's daughter in his bed and denied the child, and the room went quiet in a way that made the quiet itself a witness. They wrote a clause. It was not elegant. It was not especially harsh. It was uttered into being and then into ink with that same care Daenerys had seen women reserve for babies who had been sick a week. None of that desperate hyped edge, just breath measured and sure. Snow rose and fell. The dragons hunted. Once, on the third morning, the sky went a color so pale it was almost no color at all, and light sifted down in fine flakes that caught in Missandei's eyelashes until she looked as if some child had dusted her with ground sugar. She laughed, and Daenerys laughed to hear her laugh. She loved that laugh because it reminded her of the work that had made them both. Not miracles, not victories, but the slow brightening of a room when a fire catches. On the 4th day, messengers from the south arrived under truce with all the right formalities and the subtlest condescension. They brought letters with wax seals that looked very proud of themselves. The letters read as if written with a peacock feather and a judgeship pinned to the sleeve, and the gist of them was that the realm wished to be taken into account by these proceedings, and here were certain precedents and claims. Tyrion read one aloud and then rolled it back up carefully and placed it on the table as if setting down a frozen fish. "I have seen this, writ and writ again," he said. "It is the sort of letter that hopes to make the room look smaller." Daenerys looked across the table at Sansa. "Shall we make a bigger room?" "We will send them the charter when we are done," Sansa said. "They may stamp at it and pound at it. It will be our door. Let them bruise their hands. We will receive envoys when the pass is open. Not before. We are not unkind. We are busy." Daenerys felt something unclench at the base of her skull. She had not realized until then that she had been bracing herself for a war of letters and then of men. To postpone it by law rather than by force was a kind of war she could finally love. It still required courage. It required waking every day and showing up for the little things. She found she had that courage readily. At night, she and Sansa walked the Godswood with lanterns, not always talking. It is a mistake to fill all inces, and they were both well schooled by now in avoiding that mistake. Once, in a drift of snow under the heart tree, Daenerys reached without thinking and brushed a few flakes from the curve of Sansa's cheek with the back of a gloved knuckle, and Sansa caught her wrist in surprise and then in acknowledgement and then let it go. The next night, Sansa pointed out where the wall had been repaired with stone pulled from a ruined tower that women had pushed in summer with steady patience. One stone lowered at a time using a frame they had built themselves from pine. "The men laughed," Sansa said. "Then they stopped laughing and helped. Then they told the story as if they had thought of it first. That is the way of things. What matters is that the wall is there." "You have made a wall from worse ruins," Daenerys said. It was admiration, not adoration. Sansa did not demur and did not accept it as her due. She let it be like good bread. Once, watching Arya practice in an empty room with a wooden sword, the room her father had used to keep accounts, she was told. Daenerys found herself thinking about daughters and mothers, about the line of women that had gotten her here. She had had so few of her own and had borrowed many. She thought of Sansa's mother, the rumor of whose goodness made even enemies speak a little softer. She thought of the mother she had not known. She thought of the women who had taught her what to do with pain. She vowed then to learn to ask for help without the performance of it. She had discovered that many women did not like their queens to ask their help with a stage voice. They liked their queens to ask it in a room with no witnesses, as if they were all sitting in a kitchen preparing carrots and the asking were another slice. Around the 5th day, the first cracks in their plan appeared exactly where they should have, where money met pride. A lord with a good beard and a better smithy balked at the clause that named a percentage of winter coin to the grain bank. "You mean to tax me twice," he said, coloring as men do when they find themselves having to talk about coin they had imagined was only theirs. Once in the price, once in the giving. Tyrion opened his mouth and then shut it. He looked, to his credit, at Daenerys and Sansa both. Sansa spoke first. "Where did your wife go when the price of grain climbed last year?" she asked him. "To your hall," he said, sullen and truth told. "To your steward." "And you say I mean to tax you?" Sansa said mildly. "I mean to tax myself. The hall stores are the first stores to go to the hungry. If you wish to stop your wife from coming here when she is afraid, you will send what you would have taken from my hands, and it will be recorded, and then when she comes it will be given back to her. It will not be my giving. It will be yours to your own. We will simply have made the door." He glowered. Then he sat as a man sits when he knows he will call his own pride by a new name later and tell a story about it that makes him sound noble. He nodded and made a show of signing. The ink caught on a burr in the paper. Daenerys loved Sansa in that moment, with the practical love a woman can feel for another woman who has made a day better with words. The charter grew. 14 stones were chosen in the old wall that flanked the yard on the east, and men and women with strong hands took chisels and began to put words into rock. It would take all winter and part of the spring, and their eyes would ache and their shoulders protest, but the work began. Dragon's wings sent snow sliding. The heat vents steamed. Ghost lay half in the sun and half in shadow and kept the people honest by watching. On the 7th night after the binding, when many useful sentences had been written and one annoying one had been deleted and 2 had been rewritten until they did not lie any longer, Daenerys and Sansa found themselves again on the outer walk, the lantern between them shivering a little in the wind. It had become a habit to go there, not a ritual. Rituals demanded too much posture for what this was. A breath, a taking stock. "We will have to go to White Harbor when the road is ready," Sansa said. "That is where the first challenge will come. The sea brings both fish and trouble." "We will go," Daenerys said. "I will bring the dragons, but we will tell the harbor master when they may fly and when they will not. And we will draw the townspeople into the square and read the charter aloud," Sansa said. "And then we will listen while they tell us where their particular cracks are." Her mouth was wry. "And then we will mend them." "Good," Daenerys said. She looked at Sansa. The lantern light made the red of her hair a softer thing. Less flame, more ember. "We are doing it. For today," Sansa said. "Tomorrow we will do it again." Daenerys found her hand going out without command, and this time when it reached Sansa's, Sansa took it without surprise. They stood like that for a while, the leather not binding them now, the bond doing the work without the token. Below them, a man laughed at some joke as old as the stone he leaned on. Above them, a star went shooting toward the tree line and burned up as it fell. Not a sign of anything, and yet full of meaning for any who wished to be generous to the sky. The wind picked up and then let go. It would pick up again. That was its nature. In the morning, they would convene another circle of people who had not imagined themselves in a council room until this week and who would now carry it like a weight and a dignity both. In the morning, there would be a knock on the door and a woman with a cracked voice asking what happened when the river thawed too fast and carried away a footbridge. In the morning, they would stand once more before the heart tree and say nothing, and the tree would say nothing, and the saying would be enough. The wheel had not broken with a crash. No piece of the castle lay shat. Aired under snow, no banner was torn. It had shifted. It had found, for now, a new hub. Winter lay upon them for many weeks yet, and letters from the south would keep arriving with wax seals that looked very proud of themselves. People would fall in love and get sick and get better and die. A wagon would slide and horses panic, and 3 men would throw themselves into the traces and pull it out. A boy would fall through ice and be dragged back blue and sputtering and live. A woman would curse and then thank and then curse again and then put bread in a stranger's hand because that is how a world is made anew. Dragons would watch the sky for heat seams. Ghost would watch the ground for meaning. A queen who had tried to be the sort of story that ends with a single scene would discover she preferred the kind that take many evenings and are told in kitchens. In the deep hours when even the wind seemed to sleep and the castle breathed its slow, stone breath, Daenerys would reach in the dark to find Sansa's hand, sometimes not there, sometimes inches away, sometimes wrapped around her own wrist like a cuff, and know that binding meant being reminded and reminded again. On one such night, she woke and would not at first know why, and then she realized that even the old pipes in the stone were silent. She lay very still and listened to nothing and felt very suddenly and very simply that this was the sound the new thing made. Not music, not triumph. The absence of grinding. The absence of turning under an old weight. She lay there a long time, feeling what the absence felt like, and then she slept. The morning would bring the weight back, because mornings always do. But the shape of the weight had changed. It had been shared. In the sharing lay everything they had meant, and much they had not yet found words for. There would be time for words. The winter was not going anywhere, neither were they.